Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Community Writers Series event this evening here at virtual Germantown Friends School. I'm Dana Weeks, and I have the tremendous privilege of being head of school here at GFS. I'm so delighted that you joined us this evening for this special event. It is the kickoff to our 175th anniversary series. And as of this moment, we have upwards of 100 attendees for this community conversation, and more joining as I speak right now. So thanks all for joining us. It was just a delight to listen to that jazz as we gathered in our rooms this evening. I know that this genre is one that has inspired our guest author over the years, and you might hear more about that during the conversation. As I said, this is the kickoff event for our 175th anniversary series, and I think it's really quite fitting that we're beginning with a topic of creativity, a topic that I think each of us has had to explore, and we certainly have had to improvise in so many areas of our lives for these past 8 months. So I think this conversation is particularly fitting. I am going to turn things over now to Kate Garrity, who's our Director of Library Services here at GFS. And please stay tuned. You'll hear more about other 175th anniversary events toward the end of the evening. Okay, Kate.
Thank you, Dana. Good evening, everyone. As Dana said, I'm Kate Garrity, the Director of Library Services here at Friends Free Library. And on behalf of the library and Germantown Friends School, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Community Writer Series event featuring author Natalie Nixon in conversation with Sarah Stein Greenberg. Since its inception in 2013, the Community Writers Series has been a wonderful opportunity to celebrate the work of authors and illustrators with ties to Germantown. The series is hosted here in Friends Free Library, one of the first free libraries in the United States, serving both the community and Germantown Friends School since our founding in 1845. Although the library remains closed during the pandemic, we're so pleased that both the communities that we serve have this opportunity to gather together this evening. So tonight, Natalie Nixon, GFS class of 1987, will discuss her new book, The Creativity Leap: Unleash Curiosity, Improvisation, and Intuition at Work, and her thoughtful definition of creativity, which is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems and produce novel value, and the way humans can channel this creativity and build competency in our professional lives. And we've seen this innate skill come into play in unique ways during the pandemic, particularly within the field of education, and we have surely seen creativity at the center of teaching and learning here at GFS this year. Natalie will be interviewed by Sarah Stein Greenberg, GFS class of 1996. Natalie is the executive director of the D School at Stanford University, an interdisciplinary institute rooted in design thinking that nurtures ideas and innovators. Natalie has graciously donated a number of copies of her book, and we will randomly generate a list of folks from tonight's attendees who will be receiving an electronic copy of The Creativity Leap. So watch your inboxes tomorrow, and if you receive an email from me, make sure you open it to get the link for your copy. Just a few words about tonight's format. After introductions, Natalie and Sarah will be in conversation for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. If you have questions at any time during the presentation, please feel free to add your questions at any time. You may submit a question by clicking on the Q&A icon that's located at the bottom of your webinar screen. Questions are being curated behind the scenes, and as I said, we'll have time to address them at the end. And now, I'd like to pass the virtual microphone to one of our students, Germantown Friends School senior Farouk Adger, who will introduce tonight's featured guests. Thanks, Farouk.
Natalie Nixon is an author, consultant, global speaker, and creativity strategist. As the founder and president of Figure 8 Thinking, she helps embolden leaders to apply creativity and foresight for transformative business results. After graduating from GFS in 1987, Natalie earned a BA in Anthropology and Africana Studies from Vassar College, an MS in Global Textile Marketing from Jefferson University, and a PhD in Design Management from the University of Westminster in London. Fun fact, Natalie also taught English for 3 years at GFS in the middle and upper schools. Natalie incorporates her background in anthropology, fashion, and design thinking, as well as her 16-year career as a professor, into her consulting practice in addition to writing The Creativity Leap, Unleash Curiosity, Improvisation, and Intuition at Work. She is the editor of Strategic Design Thinking, Innovation in Products, Services, Experiences, and Beyond, and a regular contributor to Inc. magazine on creativity, design thinking, and the future of work. Our next guest, Sarah Stein Greenberg, has spent the last decade as an executive director of the D School at Stanford University, where she co-teaches the Design for Extreme Affordability course. She has also co-taught the D School's foundational class Design Thinking Bootcamp, developed a class called Design Thinking for Public Policy Innovators, and launched an experimental program featuring short format pop-up classes. Sarah holds a BA in history from Oberlin College and an MBA from Stanford. Her background includes developing new products and services in a number of emerging markets in Asia and Africa. Sarah's work at the D School has resulted in innovative and radical ideas about the form and the nature of college, entitled Stanford 2025. Please join me in welcoming Natalie and Sarah.
Farouk, thank you so much for that introduction. As you were talking, I was thinking a little bit about being in your shoes back when I was a senior. I don't know if that was going through your mind as well, Natalie, but it was amazing to just get to meet you a little bit beforehand. So thank you for kicking us off. So Natalie, it's so great to be in conversation with you on this topic that is dear to both of our hearts. And I actually wanted to start kind of like where Kate was just leading off, which creativity is such a broad and expansive topic, and it means many different things to many different people. Will you just talk about what is creativity in your mind? And particularly, I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit about people's individual sense of their own capability as a creative person.
Yeah, well, good to see you, Sarah, and thank you, GFS, for hosting this opportunity to share these ideas. It's good to be here. So as Kate mentioned, I think about creativity as toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. And I also think about creativity as kind of a very forsaken element of our society, of our culture. I like to say that we tend to ghettoize creativity in the arts, which isn't fair to artists, and it's not beneficial to our society at large. It just so happens that artists are particularly excellent at sitting with the ambiguity, the discomfort of ambiguity, of really digging into process, and they so overtly demonstrate this toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. And it's my perspective that to be human is to be hardwired to be creative. You know, we observe that in our children. We reflect on how much toggling we did between wonder and rigor when we were growing up. You know, there's so many amazing ways to think about creativity as, you know, the juxtaposition of different ideas. I like to refer to it sometimes as the remix and mashup of ideas that others formerly would have never put together. It's repurposing, it's repositioning. And what we need more than ever in our society is a reframing about how we need to recenter creativity into whatever we do. And what I've learned in my career and then more specifically researching for the book is that the most incredible engineers scientists, educators, farmers, estheticians, etc., are super creative. And I ended up really wanting to focus on creativity because in a lot of my professional work, and you know this as well, Sarah, there's a lot of talk about the I word all the time. Innovation, innovation, innovation. And I was feeling like we just kind of, we tossed the word around so much that we were kind of talking over and around each other and not always having real clarity on what each of us means about innovation. And so it occurred to me that actually, I think we need to pause, take a step back, and actually start with creativity. The challenge, of course, is that we don't all understand creativity. We silo it in the arts. We will fill sentences with things like, I'm not creative because fill in the blank. I can't sing, act, dance, paint, etc.
So you have a great line in the book that's something, I'm going to poorly paraphrase you, but it's something around like companies and organizations have fallen in love with the economic value of innovation, but not with the actual creative processes that yield it. And can you just talk a little bit more about what you see in organizations that have this mindset of like, we know we want this, and yet there's something getting in our way? What is that thing that's in the way?
Well, there's a lot of innovation churn. There's a lot of copy pasting. There's a lot of busy work. And, you know, I think that there is something to do with scale and size in order to truly be creative. Even if, let's take this word rigor, which I think about rigor as discipline and time on task and incessant practice and focus, and rigor isn't sexy. It's often very solitary. And what is often happening in our work organizations is we're conflating rigidity for rigor. You know, just this steadfast fixation on procedure, on the rule book, and we need to shift to the playbook. And so work has become a place that is devoid of what makes us uniquely human. We still are really clinging to an industrial model of work, even though we claim to have gone through the information age and a creative economy, et cetera, but still there's this very much cog in the wheel feel to a lot of our organizations spatially, the way space is designed, the way we design and use time. And that ends up meaning that we show up to work in drag. And we are kind of experiencing a slow death, some of us, right? Some of us, because I've worked now in nonprofit, I've worked in corporate and in academia, and now as an entrepreneur. And as an entrepreneur being of service to a lot of organizations, I have a very different vantage point as well. So the opportunity actually right now during COVID is to redesign our relationship to work, to redesign our relationship with time. I was observing how I feel like we've kind of come full circle in some ways. And what I mean by that is back in the day, and I mean way back in the day, in the days of agricultural economy, you wake up in the morning, you do your ablutions, you eat some food, you'd step over your threshold, and you were at work. And now, centuries later, I find that because of COVID quarantine, I'm getting up in the morning, I'm doing my ablutions, I eat some food, I have a 30-second commute to work, I step over the threshold, and I'm at work. So there's a really hopeful, for me, opportunity to bring the human into work. We see more of our familial personal selves because of Zoom. We get a peek into the pet, the spouse, the child, our quirks, our hobbies. And I think that if for me to speak corporate speak for a moment, we need to shift how we are trying to promote productivity and KPIs. And, you know, one of my big what if questions is, what if our key performance indicators or KPIs were designed around wonder and rigor and curiosity and the ability to improvise? I wonder how that would move the needle and how innovative we would be and how much more productive people would be in their organizations.
So let's dive into your framework around wonder and rigor, because you're leading us there so nicely. So I think that these are two concepts that most people do not automatically put together. And I'm curious about where that paradigm came from and how does it show up in organizations where you've been helpful in changing the culture. But just kind of give us that perspective of this is one of the centerpieces of your practice and how you're describing your work. And I think it's really useful and really interesting.
Sure. So it's awesome that the intro music was some jazz music, Art Blakey's music in his one of his many groups that he led. But really, I got to juxtaposing wonder and rigor because of some real intensive heads down work I did when I naively decided to earn a PhD while working full time. I was a professor at the time, and I ended up doing a PhD in the field of design management. Research is very circuitous, and I ended up looking at the ways that the Ritz-Carlton Hotel designs experiences for guests. And I was in a very I was at a real low point in my research. I had to figure out what my theoretical construct was. I had no idea. And I was lamenting over Skype with my advisor because my program was in the UK and London. I was lamenting how, I didn't understand what that was. And then we're about to close the call. And I say, but it's interesting. It probably doesn't mean much, but people keep referring in my data. I'm a qualitative researcher in my interview data that when the work goes well, it flows. It's like jazz. And this thing about jazz keeps coming up, but I don't know what I can really do with that. And she said, well, hang on, you're talking about improvisational organizations. That led me to really learning about complexity theory, chaos theory, because as it turns out, all improvisation is a complex system. And to nerd out a bit, there's a whole body of scholarship looking at improvisational organizations from the perspective of jazz. And that's how I learned about Dee Hock's work. Dee Hock was the first president of Visa, the credit card company. He made up this word, K-ord, and he really wanted to design a human organization, Visa, this global organization based on the virtual exchange of currency that wasn't just constructed with a bunch of boxes and arrows, that mimicked more of nature. And what he saw in nature was some chaos and some order. And chaos is not anarchy, chaos is randomness. And order is not control, order is structure and boundary. So you're beginning to hear the influence that it had on me, because once you learn about chaotic systems, you can't unsee it. You begin to see chaotic systems everywhere. It's the way our bodies heal. You see it in nature. It's the way forests spring up and emerge. It's in jazz music, hip hop, all improvisation. And so that led me to really understand that the most innovative organizations are improvisational. They're not about micromanagement leadership. They are adaptive, they're emergent, and they're self-organizing. So that was a big influence when I was starting to try to unpack what is creativity. And the other way into it, what really stems from my background in dance. I studied dance since I was 4 years old, studied modern, and I really was interested in the ways that choreographers problem solve. Of so many art forms, I really think dance gets it's such kind of left out in terms of the mastery, and I really mean mastery from a strategic perspective. And I really thought of choreographers as system designers. And I was interested in intuition and leadership. At the time, I was a professor. I had launched a strategic design MBA program. A lot of my colleagues were startup leaders, and intuition was popping up in their origin stories. They would talk about how they got started, and they would say things like, something told me not to do the deal. Something told me to work with her and not him. And I was like, this is intuition. We don't touch it in business school, medical school, law school, yet every successful leader owns it. And that's when I said to myself in my nerdy brain, what if I could do an ethnography on intuitive leadership? Who would I want to check out? And I thought dancers, DJs, chefs, and first responders, obviously, because I thought that they have to intuit, they have to do a lot of pattern recognition. Anyway, I'm bringing up all these examples to say you can already see that while I can now say in a very straightforward way that creativity is toggling between wonder and rigor, it was all these influences of understanding chaotic systems thinking, of really delving into the way choreographers problem solve, that helped me to see this dynamic of wonder and rigor. And you certainly can see in dancers this incredible amount of rigor, but we've all been to dance performances or musical performances where the artist is technically proficient, but it doesn't touch you here. And that's when I was like, well, there's the rigor, but there's something else. And that's how I landed on wonder, which by then I had in my background chaotic systems thinking. So in terms of organizations, I do see examples of rigor in organizations. I see rigor when people are encouraged to when Google used to have their 20% time, right? When they would, this is actually wonder and rigor. They would actually give people time to tinker and do these deep dive explorations that had nothing to do with work. But this is also a wonder, right? Because they're allowing people to dream and be audacious. Out of Google's 20% time, Gmail came about. I also learned recently from Annie Jean Baptiste that a lot of Google's work in being really cognizant about DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, came out of that time as well. The Ritz-Carlton is certainly an example of an organization that tries very hard to allow for the wonder, but also there's structures, there's what I call minimal structures, there's fluid structures. Trader Joe's supermarket has some great stories and examples of the ability to allow people individually to problem solve while working within certain structures. And right now, during a time of so much complexity, it's going to be even more important that we design work that allows for that.
There's so much I want to dive into around that. I think one thing I just want to say, I'm really resonating with your comment about the difference between rigidity and rigor, and how easy it is to mistake one for the other, particularly rigidity for rigor. And the other thing you're making me think a lot about when you're talking about innovative systems and improvisational systems are not ones where there's a kind of micromanagerial approach or a dictatorial approach. I have often wondered about the kind of early influence of Quaker thinking on my own trajectory in finding myself in this world where we do try to set the conditions for people's creativity to emerge, and how little of that has to do with imposing your own sense of where things should be going, and much more about building people up to be able to find that themselves. So I'm wondering, you've worked with so many organizations where, they're not primarily designed to embrace a chaotic way of being. So what is it that you can do or that you recommend to individuals who are in organizations that haven't quite gotten that balance of wonder and rigor right, to either start to change themselves, change their own behavior, change their mindset, or actually start to influence how the organization is working?
Absolutely. And Sarah, let's make sure we go back to the connection with the Quaker school education, or just our educational upbringings in general. I made a note myself as well to go back to that. But I interviewed a little over 50 people for the Creativity Leap. I interviewed farmers. I interviewed our family plumber, who was like, why do you want to talk to me about creativity? And then once he sat down, he was, wax poetic about his work process. And one of the things I also did is, I interviewed people in corporate environments, PricewaterhouseCoopers and tech firms and software firms. And I went out to Pasadena, California, and visited NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. And NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena is, it's all responsible for designing and launching unmanned spacecraft. And they have on that campus a place called the Studio. And I visited with Daniel Goods and his team of social scientists, artists, designers, whose main work, I mean, my words, not theirs, is they're translators. They are engaged in acts of translation for the scientists, the astrophysicists and such, who have these incredibly awesome research projects, and they help them translate the narrative, the story of that project in visual language and plain English. And what I learned from them was it's super helpful when an organization has kind of an internal provocateur. And that's what I thought. That's how I thought about the Studio, because they engage in a lot of design thinking. They offer the fresh eyes gaze on problems. They ask the naive questions that compel the scientists to really decipher their jargon. Another example of a company that has an interesting mechanism to really spark creativity is Autodesk. A former colleague of mine is now the vice president of learning features there. And he hipped me to a word I had actually never heard of before, called orthogonal thinking, which is a lot of ways, it's kind of like cognitive diversity. But what they do at Autodesk is, well, a couple things. Number one, they really make sure that they hire people who think very differently from them. So they've hired, PhDs in anthropology and former AFL-CIO union leaders and former military generals, so that they can have a very different set of eyes and very different set of questions on the work that they're doing. Another thing they do is they regularly host, I don't think they call them studios, they might call them studios, but they're kind of these outposts, salons and conferences to really, they want to encourage disruption of their thinking. And so whether it's done by an external force or internally, one of the things that just being mindful and conscientious of asking ourselves a new and different set of questions does eventually begin to shift the organizational culture away from too big to fail, away from we've always done it this way, away from a lot of legacy thinking, to being more open to questions, which is hard to do. I mean, I was a professor for 16 years, and every time I had assigned a group project, it was like good news, bad news. Like, because collaboration is hard. When we collaborate in the short term, it's hard because there's a learning curve. You've got to learn and be patient and be open and curious about the way you do stuff versus the way I do stuff. And you have to unpack jargon on both sides. And then you might reckon with, well, why do we do it this way? And, oh, look how similar our approaches are, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's an African proverb which says that alone faster, together further, right? So this collaboration was also something that was explored by Jerry Hirschberg, who used to be the head of design at Nissan International. And he thought of this great term called creative abrasion. Whenever he had a design challenge, he didn't only want his design team to work on it. He invited people from accounting and sales and manufacturing and marketing, because he understood that while most of us avoid friction and abrasion like the plague, the friction and abrasion produce energy. And he thought, well, what if we can convert that energy, which may be uncomfortable initially, what if we convert into something positive? So that's the term creative abrasion. But it all comes down to make sure you've got people in the room who think differently from you, right? Make sure you've got people who didn't all go to the same sorts of schools, don't come from the same parts of the country or same parts of the world, aren't all the same kind of age, more or less. That sort of diversity is critical for creativity because of the new questions it sparks.
Well, and then one of the implications of having diverse perspectives in the room is that it takes time to work out some of those differences in language or disciplinary culture. And that reminds me that I really want you to talk a little bit more about something you just hinted at, which was like this idea of redesigning your relationship with time. So I think that's a key, and I think that's something that needs to happen both at a systems level, but also at an individual level. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about that. And then I promise we'll get back to the Quakerism.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll share a personal example. So COVID-19 became a reality for us in the States around March of 2020. And in April of 2020, I started to commit to a new morning ritual. And it requires of me to most nights be in bed by 10. As I get older, I'm acknowledging the importance of rest. And so getting into sleep by 10 and getting up at 6 in the morning. And between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m., I do my morning ablutions, I pray, I meditate, I have a gratitude journal, and I stretch my body for like 10 to 15 minutes. And I also happen to be a morning person. I just like entering with the stillness of the day. And I kind of tap out in terms of any real productivity by 3 or 4. But what I started by like June, I looked up and I was still, and not over the weekends, but just, Monday through Friday, I was keeping up with this. The biggest joy it was bringing me was I was keeping a promise to myself. And because COVID-19 quarantine forced me to sit my behind down, forced all of us to do that, and to slow down and to pause, at least initially, I don't know that I would have really committed to that if I was still running from meeting to meeting to get on a plane and then go here and there. And, I would not have taken advantage of that moment and opportunity to pause, to redesign my relationship with time, which helps me to be much more reflective and much more present in my work and in my day. Another short example, and this kind of can also answer what your question you just asked. Another way that I advise people to redesign their relationship with time is to take daydream breaks. I use time limits like a fiend. I mean, creativity loves constraints. Creativity is not doing whatever you feel like. Creativity is really hard. And that's why we, who are not artists, we push over all the work of hard work, creativity onto artists, which is, as I've already said, it's not fair to artists. It's not beneficial to our society at large. So what I mean when I say I take daydream breaks, I mean, I take daydream breaks. So sometimes I can only afford 90 seconds. Sometimes I can afford 15 minutes, 5 minutes. But when it's warm outside, I go outside and sit outside on the step and I look at the cloudscapes. I go by, I watch an ant crawl. If it's cold, like right now, I'll stand by the window. And it's always amazing to me how much more refreshed and revived I come back to my work, because we are probably only, I'm not a neuroscientist of creativity, but I do have friends who study the neuroscience of creativity. And from what I've learned from them, we're probably optimizing maybe only 25% of our brains. And we're actually, and part of the problem is we only are focused kind of like on the frontal lobe, not on the lateral lobes and other regions of the brain, where when we say an idea popped into my head, it just occurred to me, seems to rise up. It's because when we daydream, when we go for a walk, this is also the importance of taking breaks, we are allowing the neurocircuitry of our brains to rewire and to be ignited in other regions of our brain, which allows all of that not a scientific term, marination to happen, so that, after a good night's rest is when we're waking up, that, all of a sudden these ideas become clearer. We have this great new mishmash of an idea. So those are examples of redesigning our relationship with time.
I love it. All right, so I'm curious to return to the theme of Quakerism. So what were your thoughts when I started down that path?
Yeah, so Sarah, I mean, when we were talking before about, just preparing for this conversation, we mentioned Quakerism, and I was like, yeah, how would I think about the connection between being educated in a Quaker school for 6 years? I went to GFS from 7th through 12th grade, and the way I'm thinking about creativity, and my mind went to Meeting for Worship, where, wherever I am in the world, anyone who I meet who's gone to a Quaker school, everyone admits that, like, hated it while you're in school, used it to, like, nap, kind of mentally prep for a test, or like zone out, but zoning out is good. All of us miss it once, you graduated and you're away. And I realize it's ritual. It is designing relationship with time, with space, with community that anchors us. It is space and time that, we all know the intensity of the academic rigor at GFS that gives you permission to daydream, to, unbeknownst to a lot of us, it might have been the beginning of a meditation practice, to think deeply on a thought, on a point in space, on a line from a poem, on something that someone who just was moved to speak up and say. And that is for me a reference point of a really valuable part of the culture of learning at GFS that allows for, and I don't know if we explicitly connect the dots in that way, but allows for creative work. And you Sarah already referenced that in a learning environment like what we had at GFS, it's really about exploration. It is much more, you're encouraged to follow the process. And I especially know that to be true because I went to public school, kindergarten through 6th grade. And I even write about this in my book, that there was a moment, I was around 8th grade, I was walking down the hall somewhere in main building, and it occurred to me, I wasn't able to articulate it as such at age 13, but I realized as clear as day that my friends back home on the block, my friends back in public school, when I was in public school, I had gotten really good at giving the teacher what he or she wanted. I was really good at filling in the dot and not going outside the lines. And all of a sudden, I was in a totally different culture of learning where I was supposed to ask a better friggin' question. It was okay sometimes to be loud and wrong, as long as you could follow it up with, okay, what are you gonna look at next? What will you now explore? If that's not quite the answer, what does that now make you think of? How could you build on someone else's idea? What new questions do you have? And I'm not Quaker, so I'm not sure about this, but aren't there like in Quaker, aren't there the Quaker questions, the
testimonies?
The testimonies. And are the Quaker testimonies framed as questions or no?
I think they give rise to a lot of questions. I mean, I think I think they leave us questioning because they have to be interpreted for the moment that we're in, right? The kind of modern era, and the modern era keeps changing. So I hadn't thought about it this way, but I relate to them as if they are questions in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because it allows you to have this self-reflexivity, which this inquiry, which is so important in creativity.
Yeah. I love all those points. I think for me, there's also, there's a link to the way, like a consensus driven process, which is not necessarily the same process I might use in a creative project, but it is an intentionally designed, constructed way of having humans interact with each other around big ideas or small ideas. I mean, depending on what the context is.
Yes.
And I think for me, GFS was my first exposure to a careful construction, and even just that idea that the process is going to influence the output, right? And that it matters, and that it takes time, and that's okay if what you value is the community along the way, or the individual people along the way, not just getting to the right answer as fast as you can, which is I think a lot of how many, certainly in business, but in many organizations, kind of how the process is conceptualized.
And here's, sorry, Sarah, I want to just build on this last point. Here's the interesting thing about testimonies. And, in the Black church, there's this expression that you got to go through the test to have the testimony. Like, you literally can't have a testimony until you've gone through some incredible challenge that you then testify about. And, it's thought of differently in Quakerism, but still the emphasis, there's still this emphasis on process. The test is the process. It's that grappling with the thing, the grappling with the conundrum that then allows you to testify, that then allows you to have the testimony. But that emphasis on process is invaluable.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think about that a lot right now in the context of a topic that you and I share a fascination with, which is like, how do we navigate ambiguity and uncertainty, which is really an ever-present concern and consideration. It comes up a lot for us in terms of how we think about, what are we preparing our students to do? Right? We don't actually want them, they got into Stanford, in my case, because they were good at checking those boxes, and they're brilliant, and they have a lot of, amazing life experience, but they're not going to graduate into a world that resembles a lecture hall, and it will be much more ambiguous. And that is it's so clear now, right, in the midst of a pandemic, when we don't even have a lecture hall, right, that the environment, the experience that we need to be equipping our students for is not going to be the same one that we experience throughout our lives necessarily. So let's talk a little bit about ambiguity and your thoughts about how having a creative practice prepares you for that, or what that relationship is. And right before you jump in, I just want to remind folks on the call that if you have questions for Natalie, please make sure you write those in the chat, in the Q&A box, because we're going to be shortly switching from my questions to your questions.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So what to say? So ambiguity.
You're going to do a big pile of ambiguity, so take your time.
Okay, you're right. This is very meta.
Very meta. Yes.
So ambiguity is a given if you study any art form, right? In my case, it was dance. My sister's case, my sister is a poet, Mercedes Weathers, who's class of '89, and she did a lot of amazing visual art at GFS, and she still does pottery. If you write, and certainly I'm now much more engaged, building my writing practice, music, even the study of design, right? Ambiguity is a given, and you are expected to wrestle with ambiguity. So a couple of examples. I remember probably as an adolescent, being in the beginning of some dance class, and for whatever reason, this has always stuck with me. But doing one of the basic beginning form of exercises, plie, releve, releve, and standing on the balls of your feet and stretching through your torso, and your arms are raised above your head. And that particular dance teacher said, "You never arrive," which was this trippy concept to me for whatever reason. At like age 14, I was like, yeah, you never arrive. It's just like this existential idea of always stretching and extending. And to be able to be gifted with that really trippy, huge idea and connected to something as tangible as my body was pretty cool. And then I also think about when I was a professor, I taught business students, engineering students, and design students. And business students were consistently the worst at receiving feedback because they did not understand that the purpose of the feedback was not a gotcha moment. The purpose of the feedback was to build on the idea. Engineers were a little better, and design students were the absolute best, because part of design pedagogy is the studio, and part of the studio pedagogy is the crit. Even in visual art classes, and part of what it's training you to do is to separate yourself from the work, and which is really hard. But and in dance, it's the recital, or it's the audition over and over and over again, and dealing with no, and showing up continually. But design students, I observed, even they were imperfect at it, but still they were priming their minds to be able to receive the feedback. Why? For the purpose of improvement it was about the build, or scrapping this and revising and doing some other version. So I observe, I'm a stepmom, and our daughter is now a sophomore in college, and she went to an equally prestigious Quaker school in Philadelphia. And, we saw her go through all of the pressure, even though you try to combat in different ways as it gets closer to, college applications. And I wrote her a letter for her. One of my graduation presents was a letter to her where I basically was giving her permission to follow her heart. I basically said, you've checked all the boxes, you've proven yourself, you're going to a great university. Now's your opportunity to follow your heart and cultivate the habit of following your heart, which is an incredibly ambiguous process. I've just been going through something this week where I'm trying to figure out my real true north and my real grounding. The good news is that because intuition, which I think about as pattern recognition, is like a muscle, is like a sonar. The more we pay attention to it, the stronger it gets, the clearer it gets, and the more we ignore it, the flabbier it gets, and the dimmer it gets. But when it comes to young people, I observe, as no longer a young person, I really wince inside when I see them believe that they have to err on the side of certainty. They have to know what they want to do. And I'm so happy to say she has chosen a major where she's following her heart and she's flourishing because she loves it. It's her jam. She's really into it. So, we have to encourage the being what I call ambiguous confident in our children, in each other, in ourselves, because as you say, Sarah, right now this is a world that you're not going to get through this time with a linear Gantt chart. Yeah. That's just not going to work.
Yeah, that's right. We talk about at the D School, sometimes we talk about there are 3 modes around ambiguity. One is enduring it. One is embracing it. And then there's kind of a third one, which is selectively engaging with it. And to me, that I may never arrive, but that's my goal, is to be in a place where I can recognize that actually when I'm working on something ambiguous, it means that there's a lot of potential, right?
Would you repeat those 3 things again, Sarah? That was interesting. Say that again.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just to credit the members of my team who developed this, Kelly Schmoody and Seamus Hart, really did a bunch of research with our students and asked them to describe their relationship to ambiguity in terms of a metaphor. So to me, ambiguity is like walking through a dark forest and you never know when you're going to arrive at the other end. Or, someone who might have a more embrace of ambiguity is to me, ambiguity is driving with the windows down and the top down and the wind's in your hair. And I'm so excited about, where I'm going, or along those lines. And so you kind of see that people have distinct relationships around whether they think that ambiguity is something to endure and like get out of as quickly as possible, or to embrace, which is, I think, kind of the natural mode of people who have a really active art practice or creative practice. It's kind of intoxicating once you know how to handle it and you have a process and a way to work through those moments of uncertainty. You crave it. And then this third group that's like people who want to engage with it sometimes, or some people are really comfortable with ambiguity in their personal life, but not their professional life, or vice versa. So we're just kind of starting this research, and I think it will go in some interesting directions. But
That's really cool.
It's a cool piece of work, and I love your framing, your ultimate framing of, if you can instill in yourself a sense that you will never arrive, you're so much better off.
Oh yeah.
Right? Which doesn't mean you can't be ambitious, but you're better off if you know that it's a real sort of lifelong, there's no closure.
That's right.
That's right. Okay, so we've got some great questions from folks who are in the room, in the virtual room with us. From Matthew Young, let's see. I've often felt like the immediate stresses and challenges of the COVID pandemic have worked to sap the creativity and innovation juices out of educators, students, and leaders. One of Stanford's creativity thinkers and authors, Tina Seelig, a colleague of mine, writes and speaks compellingly about how we can be taught the basic skills of creativity. Natalie, would you agree? And how can one's creative juices be revived or rekindled amidst novel stress and restriction?
So yes, I do agree that we can be taught creativity. We can practice it. It's a competency. I made up something I call CQ. We have IQ, we have EQ, we have a creativity quotient. And, there's so, Sarah, I'm sure you're familiar with this framework. It's a very kind of design thinking type of jargon, but I love this framework, which is that we have to try to solve problems on a functional, social, and emotional level. And most of the time, we're only attacking on the functional level. Like, are the trains running on time? Maybe on the social level, connectivity and esteem among your friends and colleagues and that sort of thing. But any experience that you don't just like but you love, any product that you don't just like but you love, any service that you just don't like but you love, is delivering a solution to whatever ails you on a functional, social, and emotional level. And so what's happening to us right now in the COVID quarantine is that we are having to wrestle with all those dimensions of ourselves. And there's a lot of opportunities, in my view, a lot of silver linings to come to terms with these existential moments, to deal with how to better ourselves emotionally. If you're living by yourself, forge that social connection. And so, I try to post little quotes on a regular basis on my Instagram account. And the other day, because I launched this online group coaching course on creativity. And there's an element of the course where we talk about mindfulness. And one of the ways into mindfulness is gratitude. And there's this thought experiment that I really encourage everyone to do, which is to observe 5 to 10 objects in your surroundings and think about all of the different people who had to be part of the making of that thing. So this t-shirt that I'm wearing under my jacket, I got in Italy, and I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to go to Florence, but also it's made out of cotton, and the fields where this cotton grew, and whoever picked that cotton, or the machines that probably picked the cotton, and then whoever designed the print, and whoever designed the knitting machines that knitted the cotton. In other words, it gives you a very networked approach, and all of a sudden, that gratitude of, pick 5 objects in your surroundings makes you very mindful. And I also believe that, gratitude is the gateway to wonder, right? So if even in the midst of the difficulty of revving yourself up for another Zoom meeting, you know, sometimes the days feel like Groundhog Days, but whatever practices that you can incorporate to take care of yourself on the functional, social, and emotional levels really will revive that creativity. It's really, it's the interstices, it's all the small bitty steps. It's not, that's the other thing about creativity, which we have mystified so much. We think it's only a select group of people, the creatives. Wrong. We think it has to be these like blowout, incredible, revolutionary, super radical shifts. Wrong. Sometimes it's the tweaks that do lead to these exponential shifts. For example, I have been watching a lot of masterclass as a Mother's Day gift back in the spring. And I was watching Sarah Blakely, who is the founder of Spanx. She cut off some pantyhose. And some people would say, I could have done that, but you didn't do that. She did that. And when you learn her story, she spent an awful amount of time and energy and risk and research and being curious about the fabric consistency and who could she work with to source the materials and putting herself out there to talk to a buyer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So it's all of these intermittent steps. One of the things I keep telling my students in this online creativity course is that it's called your creativity leap. The big leap consists of many little leaps, you know, leading up to it.
I find that so reassuring and useful, and instead of the idea that you're like somehow at 0 and then all of a sudden you're at like 100 in terms of your functional creativity, like it's actually not about like achieving some kind of idea. It's like a small behavioral change that you can make a little bit. And I really appreciate the idea of aiming for wonder as the gateway to that, rather than the sort of all of the more complicated functions. I mean, that's not simple, but it's a beautiful beacon. Okay, so let me ask a couple of questions, or I'm going to combine a couple of questions because they're similar. So a few folks have questions, Hannah and Daniela, around the sort of like transition process that you've seen organizations go to. And in particular, Daniela writes, I find that organizations are very eager to commit to innovation as a slogan, but rarely go beyond. What does it take to transition? And Hannah's question kind of builds on that, which is like, what is the process from rigidity to that healthy blend of wonder and rigor? But like, how do you get unstuck if you're already halfway there and experiencing some inertia? So I feel like those questions are like, what needs to happen right at the very beginning, and then what has to help you sustain if your organization is kind of stuck part of the way there?
Okay, that was a lot, but okay. So I have to credit a colleague of mine, Sabine Junginger, who has a beautifully simple, elegant diagram, which I'll try to map out, which is basically to the first question about, like, you know, innovation just seems to be kind of like a buzzword, but how do you actually innovate as an organization? The first image is a little circle outside of a big circle. And that's the stage when a company, an organization hires someone like me, a consultant, an instigator from the outside to help them start thinking differently, right? The next stage is a little circle inside the big circle, little circle inside the big circle. And that's the stage where you have like an innovation lab or innovation studio. And that sometimes gets, that can be a place where it gets misunderstood as the place where people play with Post-its all day, which is a very dangerous place. And if there's no leadership and I don't just mean top-down leadership, but I mean emergent leadership. So an organization that understands and values people who are leading from the margins, leading from bottom up, et cetera. The third stage is you would see the circle with multiple circles saturated. So now all the different silos in the organization are also starting to incorporate the innovation processes. They lead with different questions. They're not afraid to iterate. They do a lot of lateral thinking and look for surprising places where their learning could come from. They're not just hung up on the rule book, but they're much interested in the playbook. And then the final circle that Sabine drafts up it's totally saturated, right? So it's part of culture. So the most dangerous chasm is between the second and third phase, between the phase where you have the innovation lab or studio where people go off and play with Post-its all day, and then where different departments are really starting to integrate it. Now, how do you really seriously begin to make innovation a part of culture? Well, culture starts with a shift in mindset, which then leads to shifts in behaviors, which then lead to culture change. And we value what we measure, just the way it is. And sometimes we measure things with money, compensation. Sometimes we measure things with time. Are you going to give me time to do this, right? So unless there are real practical incentives built in, where it's not just like another add-on thing I have to do, but there's a budget for it. I'm going to be paid extra to do this. I'm given time to do this. I'm going to be given extra people to this. It's going to be part of the way, what we look for and who we hire. It's going to be part of review, right? So I won't be promoted until I can demonstrate evidence of being extra curious, of improvising and being very experimental, because it's real. I mean, I was about to say no offense, Sarah, but I know you won't take offense to this, but it's very Silicon Valley right now, for a while now to be like, oh, lean is about fail fast, but it's like, oh, we embrace failure. Like, really, so many people are kind of waiting on the sidelines and say, I'm going to wait and see. So anyway, that's how I would answer that first question. It has to be incentivized, it has to be part of the practical ways that you're building your organization. And then the other part of the question was about getting unstuck. Kind of is, well, you're right, Sarah, those two questions are very similar. It starts with a shift in mindset, which then leads to shifts in behaviors, which lead to culture change. And it's what I call the baby food method, like unpack it into digestible bits. So, for example, I've given myself a challenge, which I actually need to do before I go to sleep tonight. Since this is December the 1st, I'm giving, and I'd love if everyone hey, let's all try to do this challenge. Okay, here's my challenge. It's called the December Doodle Challenge. I made it up yesterday. And I'm going to put my time for just 1 minute every day, not 2 minutes, just 1 minute. I'm going to take a Post-it, and I'm just going to doodle for a minute. And then I'm going to take a picture. I'm going to put it on Instagram or Twitter, whatever you like. Or if you don't, whatever, keep it on your wall. And then by December 31st, I'm going to have 31 Post-its with 31 doodles. So this is rigor, because I have to commit to doing this every day. It's rigor because I have a time limit, 1 minute. It doesn't seem too threatening to have to doodle for a minute. And it's fun, right? It's a doodle. I could be doing a contour line drawing. I could just be doing something I see in front of me, or just letting the pen follow the paper. But that's an example of an activity, an action. Creativity is kinesthetic. That's why I called the book The Creativity Leap. Getting unstuck, we have to also talk about, not between wonder and rigor, but also between thinking and doing. It's thinking and doing. And so there's something about the motion of doing, and all of a sudden, you're 17 days in, and I'll see 17 Post-its that so it's that effort to start small, right? Of shifting your behavior. And again, it's a promise I will be keeping to myself. And also, I hope, that'd be so cool if we all try to do this for the month of December. That
sounds like something we could flood the GFS Instagram feed with. I love that. Well, you claimed that was a lot of a question, but actually you just gave a little masterclass in organizational change theory. So I appreciate that. I'm sure everyone else appreciates that as well. We're going to do 2 more questions. The first is from a few people who would love us to talk a little bit more about collaboration, and in particular from Graham, who says, any examples of collaborative strategies that have worked with oppressive leaders, those that micromanage and are very controlling?
So when one is faced with an oppressive micromanager, in my experience, it is helpful to build allies from different places. And this actually might be a good moment for me just to share an idea that I've spoken about. I'm starting to write about it more, which is this idea of boundary spanning. And all of us, for different reasons, will find ourselves on the margins. I often find myself on the margins because of my gender and my ethnicity as a Black woman. And I learned very early on, I didn't even realize it was a strategy probably until I really hit my 30s that I realized that this was a strategy. In my 20s, I was always so fed up with being the only one in the room, one of a few, I could count on one hand, remember Black folks, Black women, etc., women. And I had my hands on my hips. And then in my 30s, in part because I was living abroad in Sri Lanka, and I was just like with some really badass Southeast Asian women who were leading these organizations. And I would observe the ways, these subversive ways that they would flip people's assumptions about them and kind of like very slowly and quietly be leading them to the well. And what I took away from that was like, their perceived weakness is really, they flipped into an asset, which is what I started to do by the time I was in my 30s. So I have had to, in many situations, build allies from different areas. So I could not count on the people in my immediate area to have my best interests at heart. And at first it was a drag. It was, not ideal, but it ended up building a capacity in me for political savvy, for astute emotional intelligence, for being able to read a room within the first 60 seconds because I had to all sorts of tactics. So when you are in those situations, it's another opportunity to be creative in how you, when you're on the margins, you have amazing perspective, right? You can zoom out a bit more. You can kind of see things that others don't see because you have to. You have to be more observant. You have to actively listen better. So I hope I answered that question, but that's what came to mind when I heard you say.
That's an incredible anecdote, and I think I think that is a great example of a creative solution to something that like maybe looks like you should fight it head on, but actually, if you expand how you're thinking about what your options are and what the opportunities are, you can come at it in lots of different ways. Super inspiring. So is boundary spanning your next book?
Maybe. We'll see. Yeah. We'll see.
Very, very cool topic. So before I ask you the final question, I'm going to tell you something that I've been told, which is that the word you were asking about was queries, not testimonies. So that's
Thank you.
Call. Yes.
Oh, queries. Isn't that interesting? Okay.
Yeah. We've been away too long. Okay. So here's my last question for you. And I think this kind of actually picks up on your example of navigating a really difficult work situation by seeing a different path. So at the end of the introduction to your book, you write, you share this amazing quote by Ava DuVernay, and which I found really inspiring, and I'd love to have you just talk a little bit about it as our close. So she said, "Art is seeing the world that does not exist. Civil rights activists are artists. Athletes are artists. People who imagine something that is not there." So can you just talk a little bit about like, why did you close, the introduction to your book that way, and kind of what that is all about, this idea of seeing what's not there?
I came across that quote by Ava DuVernay in an interview I was reading about her in one of her latest magnificent works. And it might have been an interview about her documentary, gosh, not 1913. 13. And it was also the time when I was preparing a book proposal. It took me 18 months. I went through 2 versions of a book proposal for this book. And I was just really struck by her expansive and inclusive definition of this word artist, and especially this idea of seeing something that is not yet real. And I'm a growing aficionado and learner of Afrofuturism, and part of what she talks about, I am so encouraged when I understand the lives of Harriet Tubman. In Black culture, being a futurist is kind of like part of the Black experience, because you have to make sense of a dystopian present. So you have this incredibly utopian view of the future, be it that in the Negro spirituals, the world after this life is going to be so much more humane and better, or I have hope for children I don't even see, or children have been taken from me, that there's freedom and liberation somewhere far away, or literally time travel through, Henry Box Brown, who traveled in a box from the South to the North to be liberated. So it's just a powerful reminder of how close in my own culture that technique is, how it is a survival skill, and how it totally is within all of our reach. And we all are doing it in some way every single day. And I think especially now when it's really hard, where we're having to like be a bit more hopeful and be a bit more patient, and visualize what we'll do when quarantine is finally over. And in the case of maybe some really hard news, like a layoff or a furlough or an illness or death, what sense will we make out of it? What's a future that doesn't even seem remotely possible right now that we can create? And that's what we're here to do. That's what I believe we are here to make something out of nothing. We're here to be creative in that way. So that's why I really loved her quote.
Thank you. That's a beautiful note to end on. It has been such a pleasure, Natalie. Your work is super inspiring and brilliant. And it was an honor to be able to have this conversation with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. And thanks to both of you. You should see my page of scribbled notes the whole evening. Bravo to both of you. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Please stay tuned for more news about upcoming events and celebrations to observe the 175th anniversary of Germantown Friends School. Good night, everyone, and thank you again.